The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the case was called. Sarah Miller, the seasoned juror, took her seat. Unbeknownst to anyone, she held a secret that could turn the trial upside down. Her heart raced as she remembered the first time she had met Thomas Kendrick, the accused. He was no stranger to her, but she never imagined this day would come. The evidence seemed damning, but her gut told her there was more at play. The prosecutor was a shark, and the defense was a skilled liar. But Sarah's past, one she had buried deep, was now bubbling to the surface. Every glance at Thomas made her pulse quicken. She couldn't let anyone know who he really was. Her connection to him was far too dangerous. The trial would be her undoing, and yet she couldn't help but be drawn into his web. Was it loyalty, guilt, or fear that kept her silent? Or was it something darker, something she had never confessed to herself? As the trial continued, the weight of Sarah's secret grew heavier. Every word spoken in the courtroom seemed to add another layer of guilt to her heart. The defense attorney had a way of twisting the truth, making it seem as if the prosecution had no case at all. But Sarah knew better. She knew the truth, the one that no one could ever uncover. Thomas Kendrick was guilty, and she had seen the evidence firsthand. Yet, she couldn't help but wonder, had she ever really seen it at all? The memory of that night was foggy, distant. The flashes of guilt, the whispered promises, the lies, how much of it was real? How much of it had been fabricated to cover up a truth she couldn't admit to herself? The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the weight of the unspoken. She wanted to scream, to stand up and confess, but she couldn't. The consequences were too great. Too many lives would be ruined. And she couldn't bear it. Not now. Not here. The trial was everything. But so was the secret. The pressure in the courtroom built to an unbearable level, as Sarah sat frozen, her thoughts racing. The defense attorney's words washed over her, but they did nothing to quell the storm inside her. She tried to focus on the present, but her mind kept drifting back to that night. The night when everything had changed. The night when her life had collided with Thomas Kendrick's in a way she would never be able to undo. Every glance from Thomas felt like a weight pressing on her chest, a silent plea she couldn't interpret. And yet he was so calm, so collected. Why was he not panicking? Why wasn't he trembling with fear like she was? She had seen what he was capable of. The memories of those moments, of the unspeakable things she had witnessed, gnawed at her, but she couldn't allow herself to show any weakness now. The stakes were too high. This trial was bigger than just Thomas. It was about her own survival. A single wrong move, a single slip-up, and everything she had worked to bury would come to light. Her past would be her undoing. In the corner of her eye, Sarah could see the prosecutor's face hardening with frustration. The case seemed to be slipping away. The defense attorney's arguments were elegant and convincing, but Sarah knew the truth. She had to. She couldn't let herself be swayed by the smooth-talking defense, no matter how persuasive he was. The guilt weighed heavily on her, making it hard to concentrate. Was she doing the right thing? Was she helping convict an innocent man? Or was she condemning the wrong person? Every time she tried to imagine the truth, all she could see was Thomas's smirk, his eyes glinting with dark intent. He was hiding something. And she knew it. The longer the trial went on, the more the truth began to slip away, like sand through her fingers. No one could know. No one could ever know. The secret was hers to bear. As the judge called for a brief recess, Sarah stood up, her knees buckling slightly. She stepped into the hallway, trying to clear her head. Her hands gripped the edge of the wall as she took deep breaths, but nothing could calm the storm inside her. The recess didn't help. Sarah's mind spun out of control as she returned to the jury box. Thomas Kendrick was watching her now, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. His gaze was unblinking, as though he knew exactly what she was hiding, as if he could see right through her, straight into the heart of the lie she had been living. The weight of his stare was suffocating. She couldn't let him know. She couldn't let anyone know. The trial continued, the voices blending into a single indistinct hum. But Sarah's focus was on one thing, and one thing only. How to keep her, secret buried. And then, as if to push her further, the prosecutor delivered a blow that almost knocked the wind out of her. The witness on the stand had just admitted to seeing something that placed Thomas at the scene of the crime. The prosecution now had an undeniable lead, and it was only a matter of time before they brought it all home. Or so Sarah thought. Her mind raced with the consequences. Would the truth come out? Would the jury finally see through Thomas's carefully crafted persona? Or was this just another web he had woven to trap them all? The trial reached its climax. The closing arguments began, and Sarah's mind was a storm of doubt. She had always prided herself on being a woman of conviction, someone who could make decisions under pressure. But now, faced with the man who had shared her darkest secret, she was crumbling. The defense attorney's voice echoed in the courtroom, cutting through her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is innocent," he declared, his voice laced with conviction. "The evidence you've seen, the testimony you've heard, it's all a lie, a distortion of the truth. We are all human, and we all make mistakes. But my client has made none." Sarah's heart pounded. The words blurred together as the guilt she had carried for so long began to suffocate her. Was she about to make the wrong choice? Was she about to send an innocent man to prison for a crime she knew he didn't commit? Or was Thomas the real killer, and she was simply too close to see it? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the jury box. The weight of the decision was too much to bear. The judge called for a final recess, but Sarah barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, on the secret, on the past, on the twisted connection that threatened to ruin her life. The trial was in full swing. Sarah sat quietly in the jury box, her heart racing. Every word from the witness stand felt like a dagger, cutting through the veil of secrecy she had worked so hard to keep hidden. The prosecutor's voice echoed, demanding the truth. But Sarah's mind was far from the courtroom. Her secret connection to the case gnawed at her, threatening to surface at any moment. She couldn't risk it, but she couldn't ignore it either. Her future was now tied to every decision made here. As the defense lawyer continued his cross-examination, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the past. She remembered the moment that had tied her to this case, the conversation with Thomas, the deal, the betrayal. A knot tightened in her stomach as she realized she had to keep up the facade, or everything would crumble. No one could know what she had done. She was a juror, bound by the law, but her own guilt was suffocating her. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the jury filed out for deliberation. Sarah could feel every set of eyes on her, but it was the guilt that gnawed at her most. In the hallway, she heard murmurs from the other jurors. Some were already sure of the verdict. Others were undecided. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the case anymore. All she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She knew what she had to do, but the truth felt too dangerous to say. In the jury room, the tension was suffocating. As Mark, the jury foreman, called for a vote, Sarah's hand shook as she placed it on the table. Would she betray everything she knew, or would she let the law take its course? Question burned inside her. She wanted to scream, but she kept quiet, her secret heavy in the silence. Everyone looked to her for an answer, but she wasn't sure if she could keep lying to them, to herself. The vote was in. They were almost unanimous. Almost. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the jurors around her reach their conclusion. She was too far in to back out now. It was done. But as the foreman read the verdict aloud, Sarah's stomach churned. Was this really justice? Had she just sealed her fate and Thomas's? The world outside the courtroom no longer seemed real. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Days had passed since the verdict, but Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. She hadn't been able to sleep, her dreams plagued by Thomas's eyes, silently pleading for help. The guilt was eating at her, and every time she tried to move on, it felt like the weight of the decision was dragging her back. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, someone who had made a decision that she wasn't sure she could live with. She could hear her phone buzzing from the other room, but she didn't want to answer. She had been avoiding everyone, friends, family, even her own thoughts. She was a jury member with a secret, and that secret was slowly breaking her apart. The truth was getting closer to the surface, and Sarah knew that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The pressure was suffocating. As the phone buzzed again, she took a deep breath, wiped away a stray tear, and forced herself to face the reality that there was no way out. The phone call she had been avoiding was from her lawyer, who had been handling the post-trial media frenzy. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "there are things we need to discuss. It's about the case. You need to be prepared." The words were like a punch to her stomach. Her mind raced, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Had something gone wrong? Was someone finally going to discover her connection to the case? She could hear the muffled sounds of traffic outside, the hum of the world moving on without her. But for Sarah, everything felt suspended in time. The truth she had tried to hide for so long was beginning to surface. "I know it's hard," the lawyer continued, "but there's something you need to know. The investigation isn't over, and this may affect your future." Sarah swallowed hard. She felt trapped, a pawn in a game far bigger than she ever imagined. She couldn't keep running. It was time to face what she had done. But first, she had to make one last decision. Would she let it all fall apart, or would she cover her tracks and lie her way out? The next day, Sarah sat in a dimly lit coffee shop, her hands shaking as she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. The letter she had received earlier that morning sat in front of her, unopened. She knew what it contained. The investigation had officially reopened, and the evidence against Thomas was being re-examined. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that her secret was about to come to light. As she stared at the letter, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. If the investigators dug deep enough, they would find the truth that could destroy her life. She had been a jury member, yes, but she was also the key to Thomas's fate. Her connection to him went deeper than anyone could have imagined, and now the truth was on the verge of being exposed. The coffee shop around her bustled with life, but Sarah felt detached from it all, as though she were in another world entirely. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. The decision was made. Sarah knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to face it, even if it meant tearing her life apart. She stood up from the coffee shop table, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. The letter remained on the table, unopened. She walked out of the shop and into the cold, her breath visible in the frosty air. The world outside felt distant, like she was walking through a fog. Her heart was heavy, her thoughts clouded with doubt. She had never wanted to be a part of this. But now, there was no turning back. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who had been complicit in a lie. Sarah didn't know where to go, but she knew she had to talk to someone. She needed to tell someone everything. It was the only way to survive what was coming. But the fear of what that would cost her, of what it would cost the people she loved, weighed heavily on her. The path ahead was uncertain, but Sarah had no choice but to take the first step. Sarah stood at the door of her apartment, the weight of the decision she had just made sinking in. She couldn't run anymore. She had to face the people she had hurt, the people she had betrayed. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was empty, silent. It should have felt like a sanctuary, but instead, it felt like a prison. She closed the door behind her and sank onto the couch, the weight of the world crashing down on her. There was no escape now. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she picked it up without hesitation. It was a text from her lawyer. "We need to meet. It's urgent." Her heart skipped a beat. She knew what it meant. The investigation was closing in on her, and it was only a matter of time before everything was exposed. She had no more lies to tell. All she could do now was face the consequences, and hope that somehow it wouldn't destroy everything she had worked for. Sarah sat in her lawyer's office, her fingers nervously tapping the armrest. The room was sterile, filled with the scent of freshly printed papers and leather. The silence between them was thick, uncomfortable. Her lawyer, Mark, sat across from her, flipping through a manila folder, his face serious. He looked up and locked eyes with Sarah. "They're going to call you in for questioning," Mark said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "The prosecution has begun to focus on your involvement in this case. You've become a key witness." Sarah's stomach turned. The room seemed to shrink around her as the weight of his words sank in. She had hoped that by keeping her distance, by staying quiet, it would all blow over. But now, it was all coming to light. Her role in the case was being scrutinized, and she was trapped in the web of her own making. "What do I do now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark paused for a moment, then said, "You have to tell the truth, Sarah. It's the only way out of this. But be careful. There are people who will do anything to silence you." The night was long. Sarah couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, her mind racing. Every time she closed her eyes, images of Thomas flashed before her. His face, filled with fear and desperation, haunted her. She had known Thomas before the trial, but their connection was deeper than anyone could have imagined. They shared a history that no one knew about. A shared secret that had the power to destroy both their lives. Sarah couldn't escape it. She had tried to forget, to move on, but the past wouldn't let her go. It had all started years ago, when they had been young, innocent. They had been in love, or so she thought. But love had turned into something darker. It had consumed them both, and now she was paying the price. As she lay there in the dark, Sarah realized that she couldn't run anymore. The truth would come out, one way or another. And when it did, she would lose everything. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront the truth. She walked into the courthouse, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The case was reaching its final stages, and Sarah knew she couldn't keep hiding. She had to speak up, but she didn't know where to start. As she approached the courtroom, she saw Thomas standing outside, waiting. Their eyes met for a brief moment before he turned away, his face filled with a mix of anger and sadness. Sarah's heart clenched. She wanted to walk away, to pretend none of this was happening. But she couldn't. The truth was a heavy burden, and it was starting to crush her. "Sarah," Thomas said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this. It's not too late to walk away." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's too late, Thomas. It was always too late." The trial was in full swing, and every word spoken in the courtroom felt like a blow. The defense lawyer's sharp voice rang in her ears as he painted a picture of guilt, a picture she couldn't escape. Sarah sat in the jury box, her heart pounding in her chest. Her secret was unraveling, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The prosecutor, relentless in his pursuit of justice, now focused on her. "The jury member with the hidden connection," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "Tell the court about your history with the defendant." The room fell silent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had no choice but to answer. "I knew him. From years ago," she began, her voice shaky. "We had a relationship." The words felt like poison in her mouth. She couldn't even look at Thomas. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched. "But it was years ago," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I don't know what happened to him, but I know he's not the man I knew." Later that night, Sarah found herself in a secluded corner of the courthouse, trying to collect her thoughts. The weight of the day's events was too much to bear. The trial was taking its toll on her, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply entangled she had become in everything. The lies, the manipulation, the secrets, they were all connected to her. Sarah felt as though she was suffocating under the pressure of the truth. She had done things she regretted, things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But as much as she wanted to walk away, she knew that she couldn't. Her actions had set everything in motion, and there was no turning back now. As she wiped away a tear, Sarah heard a voice behind her. "You can't run from this forever," Thomas said quietly. "I know," she replied, her voice breaking. But I have to face it now. The day of the closing arguments had arrived. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Sarah sat in the jury box, her body rigid, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she couldn't meet anyone's gaze. The defense attorney stood up, his presence commanding the room. His voice was smooth, calculated, as he presented his argument, weaving lies into the truth, bending the narrative to his will. "The evidence is clear," the defense lawyer said, his eyes scanning the jury. "My client is innocent. The charges against him are baseless, a product of confusion and false accusations." Sarah's heart raced. She knew the truth. But how could she reveal it without destroying everything? She glanced over at Thomas, who sat at the defendant's table, his eyes cold and distant. He was the man she had once loved, but now he was a stranger. "You must consider the facts," the defense lawyer continued. "There is no concrete proof linking my client to the crime. Only speculation, only lies." The words felt like knives in Sarah's chest. It wasn't just a trial for justice anymore, it was a war for survival. As the defense lawyer sat down, the prosecutor stood. The contrast between the two lawyers was stark. The prosecutor was sharp, focused, and relentless. "The defendant has had every opportunity to prove his innocence," the prosecutor began, pacing in front of the jury. "But he has failed to do so. What we have here is not confusion or a series of unfortunate coincidences, but a deliberate attempt to mislead the court." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The prosecutor's words rang true, but they felt like a judgment on her too. Her secret was out, and there was no hiding from the consequences anymore. "We may never know the full extent of what happened," the prosecutor continued. "But we do know this. The defendant had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to commit the crime." Sarah's mind raced. The truth was more complicated than anyone realized. The lies she had told, the things she had buried, they were all coming to the surface. How could she reconcile her past with the present? She had to make a choice, and it had to be now. As the prosecutor finished, Sarah felt the weight of the room press in on her. Every decision she had made, every secret she had kept, was leading to this moment. The jury would soon deliberate, and her past would come to define her future. "You have to decide," Mark had told her, his words echoing in her mind. "What side are you on?" But the truth was more complicated than that. There were no sides, only shades of gray. And Sarah had learned the hard way that sometimes the truth was more dangerous than any lie. She couldn't stop thinking about the night she and Thomas had argued. The words they had said, the things they had done. It was all starting to feel like a nightmare. Would revealing everything set her free? Or would it destroy the last remnants of her life? She couldn't make that decision alone. Not anymore. "I have to do this," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She stood up, her hands shaking, and walked toward the judge. The judge looked at her with a raised eyebrow as she approached the bench. "Juror number 6, is there something you wish to say?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Sarah swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her. The truth hung in the air like a sword, ready to fall. She had come this far. She could no longer hide. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger with each word. "There is something I need to say. Something that no one knows." The room was so quiet, she could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat. She looked at Thomas once more, her heart heavy. The moment had arrived. "I was involved with the defendant. I knew him before all of this happened." The room gasped collectively, but Sarah continued. "I was part of the events that led to this case. And I know the truth. I can't stay silent anymore." The words hung in the air like a confession. The courtroom was in chaos. The prosecutor immediately stood, a look of triumph on his face. "So the truth comes out," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. The jury member who was hiding the most crucial piece of the puzzle. But Sarah could barely hear him over the pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had finally spoken the truth. But the relief didn't come. Instead, it was replaced by a rush of panic. What now? What would happen to her? To Thomas? "We'll see where this leads," the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Proceed with caution. Juror number 6. You've just set a chain of events in motion." Sarah turned away, her heart heavy. She had exposed the truth, but at what cost? The room felt colder as she walked back to her seat. She had done what was right, but she had no idea where it would lead. And she was terrified. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed drastically after Sarah's revelation. The once cold and impersonal space now felt suffocating. Sarah could feel the eyes of everyone on her, their gazes piercing, their judgments weighing heavily upon her. As she sat back down in the jury box, the air around her seemed to thicken with uncertainty. Her mind raced, but her body felt rooted to the seat, like a statue, trapped in its own guilt. Thomas, who had once been the love of her life, now sat in front of her, looking like a stranger. His eyes bore into hers, his expression unreadable, though his jaw was tight with anger. "This is the worst thing you've ever done, Sarah," she could hear him thinking. And though he didn't say a word, the venom in his silent stare said everything. She could feel the weight of the betrayal in her chest, but the truth had to come out. There was no turning back now. The prosecutor, seizing the opportunity, wasted no time in moving forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cold, "I move to dismiss this juror for her clear bias, considering her personal involvement with the defendant." The judge, his face stern, nodded silently, but his gaze flicked between Sarah and the rest of the jury, trying to make sense of the situation. The judge called for a recess, and the gallery emptied out slowly. The once thrumming energy in the room fizzled out into a dull, uncomfortable quiet. Sarah felt her palms sweat as she looked around at her fellow jurors. Some of them avoided her gaze, while others shot her disapproving looks. The weight of their judgment was unbearable, but Sarah couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts were consumed by what had just happened. The truth had come out, but at what cost? "Sarah," Mark, one of the jurors, whispered as he leaned toward her, "what were you thinking? You just blew up the entire case." He had been sitting next to her for days, and now he stared at her, as if she had become a stranger. "I had to do it," Sarah whispered back, her voice barely audible, but strong in its conviction. "I couldn't let him get away with it, not anymore." But as Mark pulled away, his expression a mix of disappointment and fear, Sarah realized the gravity of her words. She had made a decision that could change everything. The trial, once a case of injustice, had now become a question of her own survival. The stakes were higher than ever before. Back in the judge's chambers, the debate over Sarah's fate was fierce. The judge sat at the head of the table, his gavel resting in front of him, while the prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged heated words. "She can't be impartial," the prosecutor argued. "Her connection to the defendant is too deep. She's compromised this trial." The defense lawyer, however, was more strategic, his voice low but persuasive. "She's already said it. She knows the truth, and now she can help us uncover it. She's an invaluable asset." Sarah stood at the door, hesitant to enter. She could hear the raised voices, but felt a pit form in her stomach. She had always believed in justice, but now she wasn't sure where she fit into it anymore. She wasn't sure if she was part of the truth, or if she had become part of the lie. With a deep breath, she stepped into the room. All eyes turned to her as she walked forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I understand the gravity of my actions, but I'm here because I believe in the truth. I can no longer stand by and be silent." The judge nodded solemnly, signaling Sarah to take a seat. "You've made your position clear," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "Now you must decide. Will you continue as a juror, knowing the consequences of your actions, or do you wish to withdraw?" Sarah's mind raced. There was no turning back now. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm, even though her heart was still in turmoil. "I have to see this through. I'm not leaving until the truth is known." The judge looked at her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. "Very well," he said. "But know this, Your decision will change the course of this trial, and perhaps your life." Sarah felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made the right choice. But there was no turning back now. The trial was no longer just about the law. It was about redemption, justice, and the cost of keeping secrets. The trial resumed the next day, but the tension in the courtroom had shifted. Sarah could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. The prosecutor's gaze seemed to linger on her longer than before, as if he knew something she didn't. The defense, too, had become more aggressive, challenging every word Sarah said. And then, during a brief recess, Sarah overheard a conversation between two jurors. "Do you really think she's on our side?" one of them whispered. "I don't know," the other replied. "But I've got a bad feeling about this. She's hiding something." Sarah's heart sank. The truth was out, but now, everyone was questioning her. She had become a target, a pawn in a game she never wanted to play. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and she knew she had to make a choice: reveal everything and risk everything, or remain silent and let the case unfold. The weight of that choice crushed her. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. Sarah's decision to stay had shaken everyone. She sat at the jury box, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, trying to control the tremors running through her. The weight of her actions had sunk in, but there was no going back. Thomas, seated just across from her, glanced up. His gaze was hard, yet something in his eyes spoke of betrayal. The tension was palpable as the trial reached its final stages. The prosecutor stood offering his closing statement, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She was trapped in a maze of guilt and secrets. What if the truth tore everything apart? What if revealing it meant losing her own freedom? As the closing statements ended, the jury was sent out to deliberate. The room was suffocating, the weight of each decision pressing on Sarah's chest. "We need to come to a verdict, Mark," the foreman urged, his voice breaking the silence. But Sarah could barely focus. Her mind kept circling back to her secret. She had come this far, but now, facing the decision of whether to speak up or remain silent, the truth seemed impossible to face. Her heart raced as the voices of the other jurors faded into the background. She was standing at a precipice, unsure of whether to step forward or fall back into the shadows. In a moment of clarity, Sarah stood up abruptly, silencing the room. "I have to say something," she said, her voice shaking. All eyes turned to her. "I know more than you think. I know the truth." Gasps echoed around the room, but Sarah wasn't done. "Thomas didn't do it, but I'm the one who made sure he would be accused." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of buried secrets. The room was still, and all Sarah could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The judge's voice broke through the silence. "This trial has reached its conclusion. The truth is out, and now the consequences must be faced." Sarah felt the sting of the words, but it was a relief to finally be free of the secret. She had spoken the truth, but at a cost. The courtroom was in chaos as people rushed to leave, but Sarah stayed rooted to her seat. She had made her decision, and now there was nothing left but to face the consequences.